And that brings us to one of the highlights of this evening, the Robert L. Biblo Lecture. It was established in 1995 in memory of the Center for Practical Bioethics board member, a remarkable healthcare leader, having led the Harvard Health Plan and served as vice president of the Commonwealth Foundation. Tonight, that lecture will be delivered by Will Schwalbe. Will has worked in publishing, most recently as senior vice president and editor-in-chief of Hyperion Books, and as a journalist from the New York Times and South China Morning Post. In the world of new media, he is founder of Cookster.com, which organizes the best cookbooks and recipes and makes them universally accessible. And tonight, as the New York Times bestselling author of the End of Your Life book club, he is with us to talk about the most touching thoughts and experiences he has ever put on paper. This deeply personal and revealing book about the shared experience of a son and his mother's insightful exploration of the meaning of life through their mutual love, mutual love of each other and literature is nothing short of inspiring. I found it to be a book that I could put down and pick up and still feel like I was engaging in the conversation with both of them. That was always telling me and waiting for me, always unfinished and more to discover at intimate levels in engaging them. Most importantly, this conversation was a gift of sharings that created memories, memories that outlive our deepest sorrows. I trust that you will get a glimpse of that tonight as you listen to his reflections and as you share in your table conversations. Hopefully your supper talk then can seed the beginnings of new conversations in your own families with those you love, those you care for, and those who will care for you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium, Will Schwalbe.
Wow, well, thank you so much to John. That was such a wonderful introduction. You may know him as the president and CEO of the Center for Practical Bioethics, but I know him as my newest and bestest email pal. And I want to say how deeply honored I am to be at this benefit for the Center for Practical Bioethics, and how moved I am to see this incredible group of people come to support this extraordinary work. I should also add, it does not take much prodding to get me to visit Kansas City, because it's one of my favorite cities in the country. It's also really moving for me to start this evening by hearing Melba Lewis sing. I have chills left over from that, and to be in the company of Virginia Stowers, who's being honored for her amazing, amazing work. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about and reading from the End of Your Life book club. And this is a book that I wrote about the books that I read with my mother when she was dying. But I also like to think it's a book how books tell us what we need to do with our lives and in the world. Of course, it's also a book about mothers. So it's incredibly fitting to be here as you honor mothers with this program, with your work, and I should add with the gorgeous cards that were at the table, and also with something that was a particular favorite of my mother's, chocolate. Did I say a particular favorite of my mother's? I actually kind of meant a particular favorite of mine. If anybody doesn't want their chocolate, I'm sitting right over there. So, okay, the book. Here's the backstory. In October 2007, my then 73-year-old mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that had spread, stage 4B pancreatic cancer. This is very frequently fatal within 6 months. But my family was incredibly lucky, both in the extraordinary care we received and in the fact that my mother lived for 2 years. During this time, my brother and sister and father and I all took turns accompanying Mom to her various treatments and tests and appointments. And as it worked out, I usually went with her to chemo. And from that very first time I went to chemo with her, we started doing what we had done all our lives, which is talk about books. And right away we realized we had formed a very peculiar little book club, one with only 2 members, a mother, and a son. Now, I should add, when I first said to my mother, Mom, if we keep meeting like this and talking about books, it's kind of like a book club, she said, "Oh, sweetie, don't be silly. It can't possibly be a book club." And I said, "Really? Why not?" And her answer was, "Because there's no food." So I said, "Okay, fine, Mom. This will be the world's only foodless book club." And we were off to the races. So the book that I wrote is about the conversations I had with my mother, what I learned from her, and what we both learned from the books we read. And these varied enormously. We didn't set out to read sort of great books at the end of her life. We read whimsically, we read promiscuously, we read the way we always had. Books people gave her, books we read good reviews about, books recommended to us by spectacular independent booksellers like Rainy Day. We read authors like, yes, let's give him. I have to say that the Rainy Day booksellers are my heroes, and it's also a huge honor to be here with them. We read Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. This was a book that I had always pretended to have read, but never actually had. We read Big Machine by Victor LaValle. We read Updike and Monroe. We read Russell Banks and P.G. Wodehouse. We read Mary Oliver and Geraldine Brooks. We read Jhumpa Lahiri and Khaled Hosseini. We read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. We read Buddhist books. We read religious books. We read everything. And like most book groups, we talked. We talked about things big and small, sometimes really big things like courage and faith and even death, and sometimes not so big things like writing thank you notes and the importance of shelf liner. This was one of my mother's favorite topics. I think it was generational, but when I told her that I actually put my clothes in a chest of drawers on the wood without shelf liner, you really would have thought I told her I ate my food off the floor without a plate. The marvelous thing was, when we were reading, we weren't a sick person and a well person. We were two readers on a journey. Books took us out of the chemo suite and brought us to all the corners of the world. And they also brought us far more deeply into our own lives. Perhaps the most important book we read was the first, Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. And by the way, if any of you haven't read that book, read that book. It's a masterpiece. Now, in Crossing to Safety, there's a character named Charity, and she's dying of cancer. And don't worry, I'm not spoiling anything. You know that on the first page. Charity's husband is named Larry. And I was able to ask my mother if she thought that Larry would be okay after Charity died. And Mom said, yeah, she thought Larry would be very sad, but he'd be okay. Now, of course, we weren't talking about Larry. We were talking about my father. And that's a conversation I don't think we could have had if not for that book and our book club. It was just too painful. Now, before I say anything more about the book, I should probably tell you something about my mother. When I was growing up, my mother had been an educator. She was director of admissions at Harvard when I was a small and then middle child. Then she was a guidance counselor at a high school, and then head of a girls' high school. And then when she was in her mid-50s, her life was changed suddenly and totally by the appearance of a postcard in the mail. And it said, "Dear Marianne Schwalbe, I am a nun on the Thai-Lao border, and I need your help." And therein started a correspondence. The nun needed $20. Mom sent her $20 to buy some coloring books for the children. The nun needed a couple more dollars, and Mom had her school children making things for the children at this refugee camp. And then one day the nun sent Mom a letter, and it said, I need $1,300 to fix the new water treatment plant. And my mother wrote back and said, I would love to help, but I can't afford that now. And the nun wrote right back and said, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm a nun. I didn't realize that was a lot of money. And then she said, but if you want to help, why don't you move to the camp and work with us? And my mother said to my father, I love you, don't worry, I'll be back. And she said to the school, I need a break. And she said to my sister who's graduating from college, come with me. And off they went. And my mother came back transformed by the experience after months working on the Thai-Lao border. And she went on to be the founding director of something called the Women's Refugee Commission, which was an organization founded under the auspices of the IRC to work with women and children refugees. And this work was her life's work for the rest of her life. And it brought her to refugee camps all over the world. It brought her to Gaza and East Timor, to Darfur, Burma, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Sudan, Bosnia, almost always during wartime. And it brought her many times to Afghanistan, especially to the tribal regions. There was a story she'd love to tell about her first of 10 trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan. She was going over the Khyber Pass, and she became separated from her group. And she had to spend the night with 23 Mujahideen warriors in a sort of guest house. And I asked her later, Mom, were you scared? And her answer was unequivocal, no. And then she added, but they were terrified of me. Everywhere my mother went, she heard the same word, books. That's what refugees wanted, more than almost anything, books for themselves, for their future. With books, there was hope. Without books, there was none. Now, my mother taught me many things, and one of them is this. Reading is not the opposite of doing. Reading is the opposite of dying. Books are how we take part in the human conversation. Books are a language to discuss the things most difficult to discuss and most important. And books in whatever form, electronic, even though that wasn't for her, or printed or audio, are how we know what we need to do with our lives and in the world. When I was growing up, my mother would never say, why don't you put down that book and do something? For her, reading was doing something, and it was something huge. Now, the reason I called the book The End of Your Life Book Club is because I really wanted to convey another thing I learned from Mom, and from her death, and from the experience of losing friends of all ages, and it's this. We are all in end of our life book clubs, from the day we are able to read or have books read to us. And there's not a single person in this room who knows what's the last book you'll read, or what conversation about a book is the last you'll ever have. So the book is really a reminder to myself and a plea to others to make each book and each conversation count. And that's just as you're all doing with this incredible work with the center. And that's why I'm not really just on an endless book tour. I'm actually on a crusade, and I need your help. We all ask each other a lot of questions. How did you sleep? What do you want to have for dinner? Did you just cut in front of me at line? Or my personal favorite question, are you going to finish that? But I want us to ask a very different question, a very particular question. I want to ask a whole lot more, and it's this one. What are you reading? It's a simple question, but a very powerful one, and it can change lives. If you're reading the same book, you have something in common. If you aren't, you have something to learn, and you can soon have something in common. I think of the messages I received about the book, my favorite one came from a woman who wrote me, and she said that she was a grandmother, and she lived in Florida, and she had a grandson who was the apple of her eye, but when he hit about age 10, their wonderful phone conversations evaporated. And she found she would say to him, how was school? It's fine. What are you doing? Nothing. And she wrote me that she asked him a different question one day. She said to him, what are you reading? And he said, The Hunger Games. So she went to the library, and she got a copy of The Hunger Games, and she read it. And she said it transformed their relationship. The next time they spoke, she wasn't a grandmother pestering her grandson. They were two readers on a journey. They couldn't wait to talk and speculate about what would happen next. One question, what are you reading? I hope you'll ask that of each other as you eat your meal. Now, before I conclude my comments, I just want to end with one note. When my friends first heard that I was going to write about my mother, some of them said to me the following: "Oh, that's great. That will give you closure." And I said to them, "That's not why I'm writing the book. I don't want closure. I want to continue our conversations." And I think that's what books do. When age 16, I turned the last page of David Copperfield, tears streaming down my face. That wasn't the end of my relationship with David Copperfield. It was only the start. I still talk to David Copperfield all the time. And I talk not just to David, I talk to Steerforth, and yes, little Emily. Just as I talk to my mother. The talking is joyful. It's the forgetting that's not. And that's why my experience of writing this book was incredibly joyful, and the experience of being here with you who support this incredible organization that encourages and facilitates and gives tools for this kind of conversation is incredibly joyful too. Thank you.